Great. Go.
Okay, hi everybody. This is Jeremy, he, him. I'm the North Brooklyn representative to the steering committee, and a proud member of the political education group in North Brooklyn. And I'm here to welcome everybody to our last night school of the fall semester. This night school, you know, one thing, the reason we do night school, why I'm involved in political education and so many other talented organizers do this work is because we believe that one of the strengths of the socialist movement has always been combining activism and a will to change the world. And, you know, everybody, political education is not a space to go to escape activist work. Our firm belief is everyone here should be, you know, putting up door hangers to tax the rich this next week. But combined with that activism to change the world is an attempt to understand and to strategize why the world is the way it is and how we best leverage our power and organize more power to change it. So, you know, night school really tries to touch on fundamental issues in socialist strategy to clarify our strategic orientation. It also aims to help us come together and consolidate and articulate our values, so better to say them to other people and help people understand what our movement stands for, and then to orient us towards action. So that's night school in a nutshell, and we've had a wild, rollicking semester. For those who've been here for the whole thing, for those who are here for the first time, welcome. And we're so lucky in our final session for the semester, and there is a winter semester, I'll say again, stay tuned at the end for announcements about that. But for our final session for this semester, we're so lucky to be joined by Rachel Himes of Central Brooklyn DSA. Rachel is an art history PhD student at the moment and a leader in our organization. Many of you may have seen her, for instance, present in the big call we did after the initial eruption of the George Floyd protests for defund NYPD. And Rachel is a leader in our defund activism in NYC-DSA. And I really welcome to North Brooklyn, and I look forward to your presentation. Thanks, Rachel. Take it away.
Sure. Hey, everyone. Nice to be here. I'm a Central Brooklyn branch member. I'm on the Central Brooklyn organizing committee, but it's nice to conceptually move northwards, although not physically. But yeah, tonight's session is focused on social movements. I think social movements are one of the most challenging things for us to strategize and organize around on the left. They're massive, they're unwieldy, they're unpredictable, and because of their scale, they necessarily involve people with a wide variety of political orientations, from anarchists to liberals, and they involve all kinds of groups, from like religious organizations, churches, to socialist organizations like DSA, and also they encompass and include people with a lot of different political orientations. This is all can be present in a mass movement. In fact, I would say if there is like a single group or single organization that has ownership of the movement, sets the agenda, the terms, the strategy, then that is probably not a mass movement. My first contact with any kind of left politics, and this probably holds true for a lot of people, was through a protest. In fact, a protest against the Iraq War during the second Bush administration, W. Bush. And in some ways, we live in a moment of movements, from that anti-war movement of the early 2000s to Occupy, to Black Lives Matter. And I think, you know, what to think about is like, you know, what defines the movements of our generation, and how are they similar, how are they different from the definitional American movement, the civil rights movement, and, you know, what can we learn from those similarities and differences? And of course, we're talking about this now. This would be important anyways, but we're talking about this now because this summer saw a massive uprising, you know, following the murder of George Floyd at the hands of the Minneapolis Police Department at the end of May. The following few months saw the largest protests in US history. Polling at this point indicates that between 15 and 25 million people took part in some kind of protest, and protesters used a variety of tactics. We saw mass marches and nonviolent tactics. We saw ongoing occupations like the one at City Hall here in New York. We saw like rioting, looting. We saw the burning of police precincts as a tactic. We saw symbolic actions like the toppling of monuments. And we also saw workplace and union actions. For instance, workers held walkouts and work stoppages. In one of the largest, for example, the International Longshore and Warehouse Union shut down 29 West Coast ports for the day. And then, here in New York City and also in Minneapolis, bus drivers refused to transport people arrested at protests as a work stoppage. And we've also seen, cogent demands emerge from these protests, especially demand to defund the police and invest those funds in communities. And then these fights now are playing out at the local level because that's where the power to defund the police resides. And some have already been successful to some degree. Another outcome that we've seen is federal and state legislation that is responding to the protests, but a lot of this has to do with either regulating police officers' use of force and instituting additional accountability measures. So these are what we would mostly call reforms, and they're quite different from the demand to defund the police, which is, we've been calling it like a non-reformist reform, or reform that has the eventual goal of ending the sort of structural oppression that the police can wreak upon Black and brown communities in particular. What we've also seen as an outcome of the protests is a significant backlash, and not just from Trump, who talked about them all the time. Republican Senate and House candidates just well outperformed polling and expectations. So despite Biden's significant victory, there was kind of like a small red wave. And a lot of these Republicans were running on platforms and with aggressive attack ads that were playing to fears about the riots and the danger associated with defunding the police. So like calls to law and order. And we even saw this here in New York City, which was surprising to me, although maybe it shouldn't have been. So we're still really close to this movement. It literally just happened. Its repercussions are still unfolding. I'm sure that every single person on this call was involved in the George Floyd uprising in some way. So we're in a good position, and it's a good time to start reflecting on important questions about social movements and how an organized left should relate to them. So some questions I think that we can consider in the next little while, looking both at the first and second wave of the Black Lives Matter movements and the civil rights movement are like, where do movements come from? Under what conditions do they take place? What tactics do they use? What kind of power do they exercise? And then like for us, and this is the organizational standpoint, what is the role of organizations in social movements? And I think that last question is an important one for us, and it's one which I don't really have the answer to. In fact, I don't really know if I have the answer to any of these questions. I know that on this series, you've seen like some published authors and scholars, but that's not really my relationship to this material. So I'm really like interested in thinking with everyone on this call about these questions. I'm not like an expert. And like over the next time, I'm gonna, share a lot of examples from Black Lives Matter and from the civil rights movement, but I'm not gonna like be giving a chronological history of either movement. And there's lots more examples that I'm like not gonna cite that maybe will come up in our discussion. But to begin thinking about like social movements, the first question I ask is, where do they come from? Often an event is a catalyst, as with the murder of George Floyd, or for example, the not guilty verdict following the beating of Rodney King at the hands of the LAPD. But these catalysts, these sort of like ignition points, aren't occurring in a vacuum. In both of these cases, both with George Floyd and with Rodney King, just as two examples, the background is like decades and decades of police violence and harassment. For example, in LA before the Rodney King riots, also unemployment rates were nearing 50% in South Central LA. And for this summer, for the uprising this summer, COVID was really the context. People were losing their jobs, their homes. There was like little to no response or protection from city, state, or federal governments. So context, I think, is really key for thinking about how movement starts to take place. And contexts like these aren't just sort of the unspoken demands of the movement, the sort of like unspoken backgrounds. I think they're critical for the types of demands that can be made, the types of demands the movement can make that will mobilize people and that will win concessions. I think defunding the police would not be as salient or as moving of a demand without COVID austerity, but also it wouldn't be as good of a demand if we weren't experiencing like decades upon decades of the compounding effects of like neoliberal austerity. So like our context today is a really important one. And I think that even extends to the Biden administration. I would argue that the conditions for concessions in a mass movement are much more favorable under a Biden administration than they would have been under a Trump administration. Another like historical context that was really important, and I think this came up in one of the readings, has to do with conditions under which concessions can be made to mass movements. So it's been argued that without the conditions of the Great Depression was devastating for the working class, but it was also devastating for businesses. And there's an argument to be made that the concessions of the New Deal, which to some extent were intended to rehabilitate consumer power, would simply not have been possible without sort of the context in which they occurred. So that's sort of like thinking about broadly like what has been happening, what is happening, and how does that set off the movement, and how does the movement relate to that context. Something that I think is also really importantly true about social movements is the way in which they are patterned on, structured by, and relate to systems in our society. Social movements are like really highly reliant on the systems and structures that exist. And this happens in terms of structuring demands. It's like, you know, what do we want? What is it possible for us to win within the systems that exist? That's not always an end goal, but it's sometimes an important starting point. Another sort of systematic feature that's important is like, who has the power in the structures of power that exist to grant us that demand? Who has the power to make the concession? That's the person that pressure needs to be applied to. And then also this question of like tactics. How do we make that person make the concession? So conditions are really significant. And sort of like, you know, how do structural conditions inform social movements? I think one key to answering this question is something that Francis Fox Piven brought up in one of the, maybe more than one, in some of the readings that you might have done for this session, the concept of disruptive power. So Francis Fox Piven theorizes that power is distributed unequally, but still distributed throughout society, across groups, across classes. And what disruption is, she says, is the activation of that power within this sort of interdependent system. So that power is activated by the withdrawal of cooperation. So like a group has power to withdraw their cooperation from the system, and that's where their disruptive agency comes from. And that probably sounds a little, you know, vague, but we can think of some like really clear examples. For example, a strike, workers are withdrawing their cooperation by withdrawing their labor. On a rent strike, tenants are like refusing to pay. It's a withdrawal of their cooperation. That's where their power comes from. I think another historical example of the exercise of disruptive power, we can look to the civil rights movement. So for example, in 1963, organizers and members of the movement engaged in a sustained disruption of business in downtown Birmingham. They created a crisis for business owners. Retailers lost an average of about $750,000 a week in the currency of 1963. And so after losing, you know, massive sums of money for week after week after week, for 5 weeks, in fact, business leaders put pressure on the government officials in Birmingham to desegregate public spaces, and they did. So it's an example of the exercise of disruptive power that gained a concession pretty rapidly. So I think, you know, what is key to the exercise of disruptive power is for people who are mobilizing to recognize what relationships, what social relationships, what economic relationships, what political relationships, what they are, what relationships they are enmeshed in. Those relationships determine their disruptive capacity. They structure disruptive possibilities that are open to them. For example, like another thinking about like strikes, like unemployed people cannot go on strike. They do not occupy the structural position that would allow them to exercise that disruptive power and make demands of employers. So I think it's really important to like be aware of like, you know, where is our power? Where can we leverage it, and against whom? I think another, you know, example of like structuring conditions, we could think about maybe the university context. During the Vietnam War, there was a massive wave of student mobilizations on university campuses. And it's not like that university campuses are like the #1 most ideal spot to protest the Vietnam War, but it is that students had disruptive capacity within the context of the universities at which they were enrolled, and they did not have the same kind of disruptive capacity elsewhere. So I think that's a historical moment that people were aware of their sort of structuring conditions, and it, you know, is an example of this idea that movements need to be context specific. And there are leaders out there, for example, in the civil rights movement, making determinations about like where is a good place to operate. For example, in the example of Birmingham, Martin Luther King Jr. and other Southern Christian Leadership Conference leaders chose Birmingham as a site for action specifically because it was a segregationist stronghold, and therefore had the highest potential for the white backlash that was an important part of the strategy of nonviolence they were engaged in. So it wasn't just like random that they were there for a reason. It had to do with the structural conditions going on in Birmingham at that moment. I think another sort of key piece of this idea of disruptive power is that the actors need to be aware of the rules that are governing the structural relationships. They need to be aware of these rules in order to strategically defy them. Whether those rules are like legal or contractual. So are they going to defy property rights by destroying a building? Are they going to defy labor relations, that set of rules, by walking out? Or are they going to defy, like, here it's a little more complex, but like maybe like social and cultural rules? One historical example of like defying a sort of cultural rule, we can think of the voter registration drives during the civil rights movement in 1964. So in this moment of activism, mostly student organizers ventured into like rural and largely Black communities in the South to register voters. And they were like allowed to do that. There was no like rule that said that they couldn't register people to vote, but there were social structures in place that they were strategically defying. So I think, you know, what that tells us a little bit is that the capacity for disruption is always historically contingent and site specific. It's historically contingent in that, for example, like voter registration would not be an effective disruptive tactic today. There's like no structural limitations on doing that. In fact, it's like what a lot of liberal reformer types would want us to do instead of mobilizing to defund the police. So I think like that's a little bit about the concept of disruptive power, is that it operates in specific contexts, and like as organizers, we need to be aware of those in order to leverage disruptive power within them. Like the really like sort of distilled version is that like social movements do not happen in the vacuum. They happen under historic and social conditions. And I think this idea like also leads into tactics. Tactics reflect these conditions, these structures, these systems. And, you know, we can look to the civil rights movement for kind of like a litany of amazing tactics. They use so many different effective strategies. One tactic that was critical to the civil rights movement was, I've already mentioned, is disrupting business. But that didn't take place only on a local scale. It took place on a macro scale. Sustained protest in the South, like years and years of protest, made Northern industry skeptical of investing in the South, skeptical of like creating jobs down there, opening factories and plants down there, opening branch offices down there. Northern industry didn't want to do that, and the South needed that. So Southern business leaders, Southern politicians become cognizant of the fact that they are sort of, their economy is suffering, the Southern economy is suffering because of this ongoing durational protest, and that makes them more prepared to make concessions than they would have otherwise. Another really significant tactic that is kind of like a macro level tactic of the civil rights movement is that the civil rights movement leaders and organizers knew that they had to force federal intervention into the struggle in the South. They had to create crises in Birmingham, in Albany, in Atlanta. They had to create the crises that would necessitate often first intervention through the National Guard, sending in like federal troops, and then intervention by executive order or by judicial proceedings that made civil rights concessions in terms of like desegregating public spaces, desegregating schools, protecting the franchise, protecting rights to vote. And they had to do this because the South was much, much, much less likely, like Southern politicians are much, much less likely to make concessions than like the president was, or then through executive order. So that's a tactic that demanding federal intervention is a tactic that's really aware of a structuring condition. I think some other like, you know, things we could take into account. Oh, and just with that, I wanted to mention, just continuing this idea, like this idea of forcing federal intervention, it eventually like played itself out. Like after a certain point, it was not possible anymore. If you did the readings for this week, Keeanga Yamada Taylor, in her book From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, cites James Foreman, who was the executive director of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And in 1964, he said that that the sort of contradiction between the state governments and the federal government were played out. And so the federal government wasn't interested in intervening anymore in the South. They weren't gonna like send in the troops. They weren't gonna issue any more executive orders. And so they couldn't use that tactic anymore. And one of the reasons that like the federal government wasn't intervening in the South anymore is because they had, through the concessions that they had already made, they had secured an electoral base with Black voters in the South, and they didn't need to give any more ground. It's definitely significant to know that one of the reasons that the president, for example, like President Kennedy, is interested in making concessions, and like so are Democratic lawmakers, has to do with the fact that the Democratic Party was really worried that they were going to like lose power in the South and wanted to grow their electoral base with Black voters. But once that happens, they're less interested in helping out the movement. But some other sort of examples of tactics that are taking structure into account. The early victories of the civil rights movement are won almost entirely through targeted actions with specific demands. So like organizers, not necessarily like leaders or figureheads, but like organizers on the ground, members of student organizations like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, or CORE, the Congress for Racial Equality. They're like getting together and deciding what kinds of like strategic disruptive action to take. You've probably heard of like, you know, the Freedom Rides of 1961. That was a core tactic. The Congress for Racial Equality put together this tactic to target segregated bus and train terminals. And they did this because they were under federal jurisdiction. So they were forcing this conflict between state and federal power, and intense clashes as young Black organizers basically occupy and forcibly integrate segregated bus and train facilities. These intense conflicts force federal intervention. And after these sort of very, very intense conflicts, there's a court order, a federal court order that orders the desegregation of all bus and train facilities. Kind of like a counterpoint to this like very specific, like only bus and train terminals, like that's where we're focusing. Kind of a counterpoint to that is in the same year, in 1961, there's a big mobilization in Albany, Georgia. And this one is really led by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They lead a large mobilization that has a variety of tactics, including like mass marches, including sit-ins, including boycotts. But even though this is a really large mass action, the city concedes nothing. They don't integrate anything. And in reflection after that, Martin Luther King Jr. sort of suggests that they might have in that campaign made the mistake of trying to address every instance of segregation in Albany, Georgia at once, rather than focusing on one or two. So we have it from Dr. King there that the movement tried to get too fraud too quickly. And that's why the city didn't give them anything, because they weren't sort of surgical and strategic and targeted. So we see that like the tactics of the civil rights movement are really taking into account like who has the power to make a concession, and perhaps even how do we create a situation where it is in the best interest of the power holders to make that concession, creating a situation in which they have no other choice rather than to give in. And this like has to do with the kinds of pressure that the movement can put on them. So maybe it's an economic pressure, stopping commerce from happening in downtown Birmingham. But this pressure has to do with like the interrelating systems in which actors in the movement are operating. Aside from like economic systems, another example of a system that we can take into account when thinking about movements is the electoral system. Here in New York City, we want to build a movement, for example, that it makes it clear that anyone who runs for city council next year needs to commit to defunding the New York Police Department if they want to be voted into office. So like we want to like exercise our collective power to tell all the candidates like no way you're getting in if you don't support defunding the police by $3 billion. And like it will be amazing if we're able to do that. But that's an example of like a movement being aware of a system that we need to operate within and put pressure within to win a demand. And like I mentioned earlier, like another sort of electoral instance is that in the civil rights movement, Democrats are more interested in concessions to the civil rights movement than they would have been otherwise, because they need to grow their base amongst the Black electorate in the South to stay in power. Another example of this idea that like we have to create a crisis to win a demand. One of my favorite stories from the civil rights movement, which is a little earlier than most people think of when they think of the civil rights movement, has to do with A. Philip Randolph, who was a labor organizer who was really key in the movement. In 1958, A. Philip Randolph was meeting with Eisenhower, with President Eisenhower, to demand an end to the discrimination in federal employment, specifically to demand an end to the desegregation in the armed forces. He was able to make that demand. He wasn't just like walking in and demanding this cold. He was able to make this demand because he had like more than 10,000 people ready to march on Washington. And that would have been the first march on Washington, but it never actually happened because Eisenhower made the concession, granted the demand, created the Fair Employment Practices Commission that worked to desegregate federal employment and ended segregation in the armed forces. So Eisenhower made that concession because there were like more than 10,000 people ready to go. But even that like didn't come out of nowhere. A. Philip Randolph had spent the last year mobilizing for it with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. So you should imagine like mostly men, in fact entirely men, who are employed in the railroad systems have been sort of crisscrossing the country as they do on their jobs. They have to for their jobs, turning out people from like every state, every city, every county, committing them to march on Washington to demand an end to the discrimination in federal employment. And only that was only possible because A. Philip Randolph had spent the past 10 years creating the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters from scratch in the face of genuinely crazy opposition. I've heard that the railroad company literally sent A. Philip Randolph a blank check and said, like, if you stop trying to unionize our workers, like you can put whatever you want on this line and we'll pay it. Just like stop unionizing. So this A. Philip Randolph literally worked for like more than a decade to get into the position where Eisenhower was ready to make the concession and desegregate federal employment. And of course, there are other factors going on as well. Like there's other movements stirring at this time. But ever since then, federal jobs have disproportionately benefited Black people. In fact, federal jobs, federal employment is one of the most reliable pathways to economic security for Black people. And one thing I'm kind of wondering about here is like, I have a hard time imagining that kind of concession being granted if like, you know, we organized 10,000 people to march on Washington. I have a hard time imagining a concession of that scale in sort of what we would want today being granted. And I wonder, like, has the state become more effective at managing, at limiting the disruptive potential of protests? Does it have to do with like the militarization and expansion of police forces? I really don't know, but I have a hard time imagining a similar outcome if we did that kind of organizing today. Like, I could be wrong, and in some ways I want to be wrong. But what I'm saying here is, like, you know, power obviously does not want to concede to the demand. They don't want to give us what we want. What power wants to do, what the president wants to do, what corporations want to do is diminish the disruptive potential of protests. And they have a lot of tactics up their sleeve to do that. You know, we could compare the meeting between A. Philip Randolph and President Eisenhower with the meetings that took place after the first wave of Black Lives Matter protests between Barack Obama and like Black Lives Matter leaders. Much as he's doing today with defund, Obama was trying to basically like redirect the energy of those like leaders in the Black Lives Matter movement from protests to electoral politics. He wanted them to, you know, get people to run for office, to register to vote. That's like the same thing that he's saying today. And I want to be clear here, we absolutely need electoral power to make movement gains. The two are not counterposed. It's like unambiguously correct that we need to run people for office, contest elections, leverage electoral power to win demands. But we have to do that on our terms, not Barack Obama's terms. But like with Obama, for example, the Kennedy administration also really wanted to divert the civil rights movement from direct confrontation in the fight for desegregation to electoral politics. So I mentioned like the voter registration drives a little bit already. Those really came about because Kennedy's administration was like, we need the protests in the South to stop. They organized a meeting between the Attorney General and the leaders of SNCC, of SCLC, and of CORE to try to convince these organizers to do voter registration instead of protests. And this actually almost caused like a schism or a split in the movement and in SNCC in particular, in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But what ends up happening is they do both. They continue to protest and they start registering people. And actually what the Kennedy administration did not anticipate is that voter registration ends up being direct confrontation. They didn't see that coming. They thought it would be like relatively nonviolent and an effective way of channeling energy, but white Southerners are so opposed to extending the franchise to Black people that there's incredible violence, murders of the young men and women who are trying to register people to vote in the Deep South. But so that kind of backfired a little bit on the Kennedy administration because it was very confrontational. But by and large, like the tendency of the state, of businesses, of institutions is to allow the visible social drama of the protest to play out, even to uplift it through their own statements and actions, but to try to severely inhibit the potential for any actual disruption. And it's not just like the state, it's like, you know, nonprofits like the Ford Foundation want to control the movement by shaping the terms in which it operates. They want us to, you know, demand police reforms and not demand police defunding. I think in particular, like businesses and corporations want to limit the power of the movement. And I think one of the ways that they do that is by acting like they are making concessions and trying to get us to like celebrate that as a victory. Like we can think of things that aren't really concessions that kind of might trick people into thinking they are, like diversifying a workforce or like, you know, hiring a really visible like executive of color or doing like race like doing diversity initiatives. One really egregious example that we saw, maybe you saw in New York during the George Floyd uprising this summer, was there was this crazy billboard for Uber at Atlantic Barclays that said something like in big letters, it was like, if you think racism is okay, delete Uber. Like that was kind of like their tagline. They were like, if you tolerate racism, don't use our service. Kind of like aligning themselves with the movement in that way. But like literally while the billboard was up, Uber was running a multi-million-dollar campaign in California to pass Prop 22, which really upsettingly passed and like exempts Uber and Lyft from classifying drivers as employees. And this is like a really terrible defeat that will have a disproportionate impact on Black and brown drivers. So we have this really disingenuous thing that corporations will do where they're trying to, act like they're supporting the movement, but like they're obviously not in any meaningful material way. And so I think that like one thing that this sort of seems true to me is that to prevent this kind of like false victory, to prevent this kind of like co-optation, social movements need organizers and organizations in the fight. I think an organized group can make the intervention of shaping the bottom line, shaping politics and demands, and helping resist co-optation and the fragmentation and dissolution that accompanies it. I think that like, one thing that we were, I think, trying to achieve this summer in DSA by like handing out lit and like doing town halls and stuff was really framing the protest. And this like obviously wasn't just DSA, but there were definitely vocal groups framing the protest this summer as a site of struggle for racial justice that was an arena for class struggle. And that's really what I think the demand to defund the police captures. And this, like, the last thing I want to talk about before I stop talking is one of the questions that is most interesting to me, which is connected, which is like, what is the role of organizations in the movements? How do organizations like DSA relate to social movements? A question we're definitely asking ourselves this summer, which is genuinely really tough. Movements are often counterposed to organization. This is a point that Frances Fox Piven brings up a lot. In the first Black Lives Matter uprising, for example, a lot of people were celebrating like the horizontality and decentralized nature of the protests. They were kind of represented as a leaderless movement where people were the source of power in a way that was similar, I think, to Occupy Wall Street. And the movement was really counterposed and placed in opposition to efforts to lead from the top down by figures like Al Sharpton. Like Al Sharpton really clearly tried to co-opt the first Black Lives Matter movement and said a lot of just crazy stuff that Kianga talks about in her book. And of course, it's like obviously true that one leader, one organization, one agenda could never have brought about that uprising. That never would have worked. Rosa Luxemburg says something about this, which I think is, kind of funny. But she says, like, the mass strike is not artificially made. She's talking about the mass strike, so like a specific kind of social movement, mass mobilization. Rosa Luxemburg says, the mass strike is not artificially made. It's not decided out of the blue. She says, if anyone were to try to, make the mass strike and like go door to door, knocking on people's houses, trying to agitate them to do it, it would be like an idle, profitless, and crazy like thing to try. So, Rosa Luxemburg says that you can't like make a mass strike. You cannot make a social movement. You have to relate to it when it occurs, as it seems to always do. So social movements don't have leaders. They don't begin from clear and definite demands. And trying to understand either contemporary or historical social movements through the lens of single organizations or single leaders will inhibit our ability to understand what that political activity was and who was taking political action. And that's something that Frances Fox Piven makes really clear. But what that doesn't mean, it means that we can't understand what happens. We can't understand the history of movements through the history of organizations, but that doesn't mean that organizations don't have a vital, active, and essential role to play to play in social movements. One thing Frances Fox Piven says that I kind of disagree with is she's really pessimistic about trying to build an organization through a movement. She warns against sort of heading into the streets to start signing people up on commitment cards and start like, you know, collecting dues in a protest. And like, that's kind of like an extreme example, but I really think that we are at a point where we can build organizations through movements. I think people are really hungry for organizations, for solidarity, for groups, even if they, like all of us who are living in this deeply atomized moment, have a limited understanding of what it means to be in an organization. I think people are ready to be organized because they sense it is through organization and through being a member of an organization that demands can be made and concessions can be won through like targeted strategic organizing. I think also like a lot has changed since Frances Fox Piven sort of wrote these texts, sort of being very skeptical about the role of organizations in a movement. It was written in 1977, and I'm sure she would like say something like different today. I think, you know, one thing that is true of now that was maybe less true in 1977 is that we live in an era that, let's see, well, in her book, sort of Keeanga-Yamahtta Teller describes this concept of the tyranny of structurelessness, and she connects this to the advent of social media. So she connects the fact that it's really hard to build long-lasting democratic organizations with clear and accountable leadership to the fact that there is an overemphasis right now on like social media activism, which creates leaders who have reach and influence, but who aren't necessarily organizers. So I think that there, you know, in many ways, I think we need organizations now more than ever because we're more fragmented, like more atomized. It's harder and harder to come together than it has ever been. So I think like I don't really have an answer to the question of the relationship between movements and organizations, but like I would say that, you know, what I've talked about is that movements arise and are shaped in response to social conditions. And so I think the role of the organization, the role of leaders in the organization is to be aware of those conditions, to make sure that the tactics and the demands respond to those conditions. So I think that is like intervention that organizers can make in social movements. And, you know, without organizations, without organizers, who have an understanding of how to win, I think people get exhausted and get burnt out. They turn out to the streets day after day and nothing is won. So I think that having organizers who shape like, you know, what's next, like what's the demand, what we're gonna do, that's an important role in a social movement. Something that I find, you know, interesting is that in the final phase of the civil rights movement, the final phase of the civil rights movement is a phase of mass mobilization. So at the beginning, there are these like strategic targeted actions, but after those happen for like a couple years, only then do people start turning out in huge numbers for actions across the city, like turning out in the hundreds and the thousands. But like Black Lives Matter is kind of the opposite. Instead of like starting with like small, intense actions, it was like a massive mobilization right from the get-go, both in the first wave and in the one we just experienced. The streets were flooded with thousands of people. So mass mobilization is what protest is to people now. Mass mobilization like equals social movement, which is incredible, but that like wasn't always true. And so, you know, my question kind of there is, you know, where do we go from here? Now that it is possible to turn out hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, turn out millions of people, like what is the next step after that? And how can we like, learn from the history of the civil rights movement to determine what that next step is? So that's pretty much my entire talk. Sorry if I was like incoherent at any moments. I'd be happy to like clarify anything that I said, but that's gonna be it from me for right now.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you so much. That was awesome. You were not incoherent at all. It was amazing. I want to go over some community rules or community agreements before we move forward to a Q&A section. These are like kind of basic things to keep the conversation respectful to everyone. First, no one should be talking over each other. One man, one mic, or one person, one mic. We will be using the stack to take questions. So once we enter the format to ask the Q&A section, you can put stack in the chat and someone will call on you. We want to encourage everyone to assume best intentions. So if someone says anything off color or something that you didn't understand, as we're all here to learn, so just assume the best intentions and ask for clarity on anything that you don't understand. Aside from that, we want to be mindful. If you find yourself asking a lot of questions, we want to make room for everyone to participate, especially voices that aren't usually heard, women, people of color. And I think those are kind of all the things I want to touch on right now. We can start going into the Q&A section. Does anyone want to ask any questions related to Rachel's presentation?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think Jeremy was on stack,
Yeah.
so go for it.
Yeah, I'm happy to start us off. Sacrificial lamb for questions. Rachel, that was amazing. Touched on so many important points. Really like a lot of material that you so coherently organized. I did want to, well, I have two things. Like one was about actually the A. Philip Randolph example that people were just talking about in the chat. So my understanding actually is that it was FDR, not Eisenhower. And the reason I point that out is not, just the history, but also because it speaks to, I think, the question you raised, which is like, how could he have, why would 10,000 people, like, why did FDR, why was he willing to make the concession? And part of it, part of it is, as you pointed out, the like changing base of the Democratic Party, that the New Deal relied on Black votes in the North that had recently been Republican, actually. So, Black voters were much less like a captured constituency for the Democrats in that period. But also, like, I think, this is when the war effort is getting started. So I think part of the explanation for maybe why the government might be more resistant to our demands now is simply because in certain ways, the government was more reliant on the population being not only like, kind of just like passively accepting the like general system, but actually like being willing to go to war to die for the country. And so, that gave leverage to organizers and protesters. And also, I guess the last thing I thought of was, being that the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters was at the center of this, union workers have maybe a certain kind of leverage, like the possibility of shutting down the railroads in order to like have this march go at the middle of the time when a war effort is getting started. Like that all seemed to me to be sort of like maybe structural reasons why that might have mattered, and things for us to think about when we think about mass marches and planning and other things, what the limits and what the possibilities are. Yeah, I guess I could stop at that. The second question I just had was maybe if you had more thoughts about kind of some of the commentary around the backlash around the recent protests. There's the kind of Obama, like, your slogan doesn't work. There have been some people on the left who've also had like, been reconsidering or thinking about problems. Obviously the propaganda was also about like Nancy Pelosi and the economy and lots of other things in the recent election. But I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts about kind of what you think the last election kind of means for future defund action.
Yeah, to your first point, you're absolutely right. It was before World War II. My notes just say like, talk about A. Philip Randolph. I was just extemporizing a little. But yeah, another important, piece of that was, in addition to like the leverage that the workers potentially had to shut down shipping systems, in addition to the threat of the disruptive power of thousands and thousands of people marching on Washington, Philip Randall was also organizing to get people to commit to black men get to dodging the draft. So telling people why would you fight for your country in a segregated armed forces? Like, why would you fight for a country that allows segregation to persist? And that was also a really important threat, because people were it wasn't just a couple people, lots and lots of people were committing to dodge the draft if there wasn't fair employment. But yeah, in response to your second point about the backlash, yeah, it is part of a larger sort of picture that conservatives are painting in the country. And I think one thing that they're really able to do that makes them really powerful and makes this type of framing powerful is that they're able to craft a narrative. The narrative involves the threat of violence that people, saw or think they saw. They think they saw violence this summer in the protests. The seekers actually did not see violence because property destruction is not a form of violence. The only violence they saw came from the police themselves. But they're able to craft a really compelling narrative that connects these disruptive protests and riots with sort of Nancy Pelosi and other sort of liberal fear-mongering, anti-liberal fear-mongering they want to do. And I think, the problem is the Democrats have no counter narrative. They don't paint any picture of they don't paint a positive picture of what this country could be like. But the Republicans are really good at painting a negative picture of what people don't want the country to be like. And so I think our intervention as much as possible in terms of messaging should be to use campaigns like Defund the Police and other campaigns like the Tax Service campaign to paint a clear and compelling picture of what life could be like that counters this negative fear-mongering picture that was part of the backlash to the protests. But yeah, I don't know if that really gets at what you were asking. But yeah, there are some other people on Stack. I don't know if I should call on them.
Next person on Stack.
Is that me? Okay. Hi. So thanks for the talk. And I was thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement a few months ago, and it feels like we're all neoliberals now. Everybody's an individual. Everyone's just there with a sign, but it's nobody's joining an organization. So I know that there was the Communist Party that helped push FDR. There was the Nation of Islam that helped, and there was the SCLC and SNCC and the rest of it. So what's missing right now? How do you think we can get people to join organizations and not just feel like the only thing they need to do is contribute as an individual? What do we need to do to get people to be proud of being a card-carrying member of an organization?
Yeah, I think you have really accurately diagnosed the problem, which is that people really think of themselves as individual actors and really think that their individual choices are highly important in defeating racism. One small sort of cultural phenomenon we saw this summer was people buying tons of how not to be a racist books instead of investing their time figuring out how to organize against racism. This obviously isn't everyone. People are joining organizations. Organizations are hopefully resurging. But yeah, what you bring up kind of reminds me of this distinction someone once made to me, between the idea of an activist and the idea of an organizer, counterposing the activist as someone who thinks that they should be working on their own and creates an identity around being having the right take, or like, you know, running like solo social media campaigns that like bring awareness to something, whereas an organizer kind of like subsumes themselves into a broader project. And that's like a distinction that's always been kind of helpful for me to think through like different kinds of actions. I mean, thinking about this like historically, like after the civil rights movement won a lot of concessions, political and economic elites were really like alarmed by the possibility of emergent working class power. And so they wanted to do everything they can to break down that power. So that's when we see like intensifications of like crackdowns on like union organizing. We see the unions starting to break apart. We also see a lot of crackdowns on like socialist and left organizations in McCarthyism. Like McCarthyism destroys anti-racist organizing in this country. So like those are some historical processes that start to fragment and erode and decay organizations and like the possibility for like organizational victories. Like the question you're asking is like, you know, how do we tell people that they need to be in an organization? And that is literally so hard. I mean, it's incredibly heartening that like DSA is like growing so much so quickly, and that tells us that like people are like sensing that that being an organization is needful. But I think, you know, one of the ways that we do it is by winning things like large and small in our communities. Like I saw like recently, I don't remember which DSA chapter, but a DSA chapter like won a fight today or yesterday to save the libraries in and around their neighborhood. And if anyone knows like what branch that is, you could say in the chat. Like that's a small victory that like makes them visible in the community, and they need to like let people know like an organization did this. And it's the same with like our electoral campaigns. Like people will join once they see that like we're doing good work and that we're like winning actual things that like make people's lives better.
Hi, I believe I'm next on the stack. Can I go ahead with my question? Is this okay, cool. So that was a great talk. Thank you so much. I think my question is not too dissimilar from the last. Forgive me if it's not a really clear one. It's just like kind of what's on my mind, especially on the last thing that you said in the talk. Because personally, for me, I was pretty heavily involved in the protests happening this summer, and like Occupy City Hall and everything, and then the results from my perspective, it felt not like, it didn't feel like we did the thing we were aiming to do in many ways. Like I wanted, like, you know, we didn't get the $3 billion cut. We didn't get so many things that were just kind of immediately a blow to me. And so I guess I kind of shifted perspectives into investing more into like mutual aid, and that's kind of where my energy is going right now. But I guess my question is like, I've struggled to know where to invest energy into right now, because mutual aid feels really good because it's like I'm directly helping people get the food and the help that they need, but I'm not affecting a larger thing, you know. But like when you said mass mobilization is what we call social movements now, and you said what comes next, and you wondered what was coming next. I like sincerely wonder and ask to you what you think is the next step. Is it massive strikes? Is it like, I don't know, you know, and how do we actually get those things instead of, because it feels like we just hit the streets and then there's like a bunch of people and then there's, you know, but nothing feels like it's happening, and maybe that's just the pessimist in me. But yeah, I don't know if that question is even a question. That might be a little confusing, but that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and you're sort of speaking to the same concerns that I was when I was sort of like formulating that thought. There is like this really tough thing where like, you know, hundreds of thousands of people take to the streets and they occupy, but it doesn't really feel like they won enough. Like we didn't really win that much. We didn't really get significant concessions. Part of me wonders, like, were the protests not disruptive enough? Like, should we have done, like, should we have burned a police precinct? I say that facetiously, but, like, you know, people did it, so, you know. But, you know, another sort of, now I lost my train of thought because I was thinking about burning a police precinct. Another thing that, you know, I wonder, which I sort of suggest in the talk, is like, are protests like no longer sufficiently disruptive? Are they like too understood, too expected by the state? And also, like, you know, are they a strategy that needs disruptive augmentation to be truly effective? But then the question is, like, you know, what other kinds of power can we build? And in this, I don't want to like only talk about like A. Philip Randolph, but like A. Philip Randolph organized a union from zero, from nothing, and then leveraged the power of that union to get a major concession. But it took him more than a decade. And I think that like a lot of people are sort of like posting in the chat, like, you know, protests are good, strikes are better. Strikes are like #1 disruptive tactic, #1. And there's been, you know, a lot of thinking about, like, you know, where would it be best to strike today? And a lot of people are coming down on the idea that like essential industries that cannot be offshored, that have to be like in America. So like logistics, like packaging and shipping, like UPS, healthcare, like that can be outsourced offshore, and teachers, those are strategic industries where if they all went on strike, as like teachers have, like that would be immensely disruptive, and that would force concessions. So like that is an arena where we have a lot of work to do before we can like Rosa Luxemburg said, we can't just call a mass strike. We have to organize to get there. So like that's the work of the next probably several decades, to be honest. But yeah, and someone else is raising a good point in the chat. Targeted protests are pretty good. I mean, the demand to defund the police is a targeted demand, defund NYPD by this amount. It's pretty specific, but we maybe didn't employ the most targeted tactics to get there in the protests. So maybe by the time we're ready to do this again, like when the next city council vote is coming up next summer, maybe we'll be thinking a little more strategically, like how we can disrupt and how we can demand the concession. But like, you know, what you're talking to is, it's dismaying. It's like tough to protest and then feel like you didn't get anything. But I feel like, you know, that is where being a member of an organization comes in. That's where participating in fights, like not just defund, but like tax the rich, come in, because that's how we build the movement.
Yeah, so next on stack is Brian.
Hi, Rachel. Thanks for an excellent presentation. Question about something that's coming up in 2022, which is the PBA contract negotiations. What do you think activists should do, and what do you think the next New York City mayor should do?
Yeah, this is a good question. I mean, many of you in this call are probably aware, but the PBA is the Policemen's Benevolent Association. I'm hesitant to call it a union because it's not in any ways really similar to what unions are, but it's like an organization of police in the city that exercises a massive amount of control, of leverage over this city's politicians. And like, it's one of the main reasons it's really hard to defund the police, really hard to make any NYPD cuts. One of the main reasons the NYPD is like almost untouchable, because people are scared of the PBA and how much power they have. So I think, you know, one thing that it's sort of incumbent upon us to do is to help people understand that, you know, the PBA is one of these like structuring elements that's making it really hard to attack or to any way approach changing the NYPD and changing the amount of funding they have. In terms of like what what our elected officials should do, whether like the mayor or the city council, I think like one thing that we want is to be getting more people to be making public commitments to refuse to interface, engage with, be lobbied by, liaise with the PBA at all. So I think that would be a really good thing to demand from city council candidates and mayoral candidates. I mean, I don't really know if I have a clear answer as to what like they should do, what someone like the mayor should do like once in office. I think that the institution is pretty durable, and it would be hard to get rid of it or do away with it. We have to sort of, I think, leech its power away from it by drawing a clear standard that politicians can't engage with it, can't be influenced by it. So I guess that's like maybe part of the answer, I think.
So next on stack is Kit Conway.
Cool, thank you. Hello, my question kind of got, I think, sort of answered or preemptively discussed through Laura's question, but mine was also about unionizing and how we can make that happen more in the States. And I guess the major question is so much of our central industries and what would be kind of understood traditionally as like a proletariat has been exported out in the past couple decades. And I'm wondering how much that might have an impact on, I don't know, the changing face of unionization. I'm just thinking about myself personally and like my friends. I feel like I work in music, people work in like tech or communications or things that aren't traditionally associated with, I think, the ability to really organize in a way that's effective or disruptive in the way that you're talking about. Well, it certainly does still exist. I'm just curious to know if it's possible or worth it to strive for similar sorts of collective action within kind of like modern, like soft skill industries. Or also, I mean, obviously like Uber and other kind of like gig worker industries. These are all kind of new territories of work. And I'm curious to know if there's any strategies for attacking this system through organizing, but in these new avenues.
Yeah, that's a good question. This is like not 100% my area of like familiarity. So these are just like kind of thoughts, I guess. But I would say I think it's always worth it for workers, no matter what industry they're involved in, to try to unionize. I worked at a museum until pretty recently, and when I was there, I was trying to unionize the museum staff. Like museums are not a strategic industry, but like for the past couple of years in New York, there's been an interesting wave of museum unionizations. And I think, those achieve two things, not just two things, but among the things they achieve are these two, which is that destigmatizing being in unions for like all workers is really important, and like all workers should be recognizing their status as workers, and that their interests do not lie with like interests of management, no matter what industry they're involved in. And then like just like a really simple level, the more people who are in a union paying dues to the union, the more powerful the union becomes to like organize in other workplaces. So like a lot of the museums most of them, in fact, are affiliated with UAW 2110, and like UAW 2110 can like use their dues, use their even their embodied support, like on the picket line, to support the other kinds of like non-museum workers who are also affiliated with 2110. That's like true of many industries. I don't know a lot about like unionization for like gig workers personally. It's not something I know a lot about, but from what I've like read and sort of cursory look, I think it's really important, and the challenge is that the big gig worker companies like Uber and Lyft really, really want to limit any kind of like collective power amongst their employees. Like that's what Prop 22 was kind of about, in addition to like not having to give them the benefits that come with employee status. So if like the corporations are afraid of any kind of collectivity amongst their employees, like that tells us like it's very good and has potential to be very powerful. But I don't know a ton about that, although there are people on this call who probably know more than me.
Next on stack is Carol. It seems you're still on mute, Carol.
Maybe one of the...
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Rachel. It was very excellent summary of the readings and the way you brought them together. Very good. I read in the New York Times that when they analyze the election results, what they're finding is that working class people of all races and colors, white as well as Black and Latina, voted for Trump because they saw Trump as more responsive to their economic needs. And the Democrats, I think, are starting to pay attention to the fact that there really are very acute needs that include, I mean, everything from healthcare to funding preschool education, student loan problems, many other things. And the question is, I mean, given the kind of cabinet that Biden is setting up and the people behind the Democratic Party, speaking nationally, how do you begin to raise these economic issues within the context of, for example, a really important organizations and really important protests like Black Lives Matter? How do we do that? I mean, how can we begin that process? That's my question, really.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of think we're maybe, I think we should recognize like where we are in this process. I would say like we're in a much better place vis-a-vis class consciousness than we were. Like I would really say I'm a big Bernie bro, or I was, but like I would say that like after Bernie's two candidacies, we're in like a much better place vis-a-vis like class consciousness and creating the sense of like opposition between like almost everybody, like working class largely, and like establishment politicians and their linkage with capital. So I think that like we are in a promising place to be developing that kind of fissure and sort of fracture, and to be setting up this opposition in people's minds. I mean, for me, I think this kind of, connects to what I was sort of saying earlier in response to Jeremy. I think that like Trump is really good at like marketing himself as a populist and as someone who's listening to and responding to the anxieties of the working class, which he like absolutely isn't, but he's really good at like making people think that he's doing that. And like the Democrats who run for office do like nothing of the kind. Their politics are like so milquetoast, they're so moralizing, they're all about like returning to the status quo, but like, that doesn't mean anything super positive to like most people. Most people don't have positive associations with the status quo. They're into like, opposition. And like Trump has made them think their enemies are, one set of people and their enemies are actually like capital class. So I think like, this is an intervention that we need to be making at every level in terms of our narrative. And this is the kind of story that we're spinning here in New York City when we knock on doors and we tell people about, knock on doors, when we call them on the phone and tell them about our socialist candidates. This is like sort of the tale we're telling on the state level that is also like true at the national level. So, yeah.
Next on stack is Ashley.
Hi. My question is kind of in response to a conversation I had with a fellow DSAer, a conversation I often have. What are your thoughts about DSA as like its potential as an inherently revolutionary body when we have a struggle with like actually being led by people of color, by women, by actual poor people? I think for many of us, or at least me, I notice there's a very specific few groups of people that are ever present in DSA. So if we cannot seem to replace leadership and the dominance of our body with like the people that are on the ground, poor people, people of color, women, how can we be inherently revolutionary? That's it.
I'm muted. I'm sorry. It's a really good question. I got distracted right in the middle of you asking it because Jeremy's cat entered the call and it was just like an eye and it was really chaotic to see. But yeah, like what is, it's significant that DSA's composition, racial composition, and like to some extent, class composition is not mirroring, is not like representative of like the working class that we need to organize with to secure the change we need to make in this country for like a better society for everyone. Like that is significant. I mean, there are like historical examples of solidarity that we can look to think about like how we can actually. No, I'm not gonna delve into it. I was gonna talk about like the Communist Party a little bit, but I don't think it's a good frame of reference. I think that this is a really tough question. I don't really have a super formed answer to it because we're still figuring out how to, grow our organization, how to build leaders of color, how to grow our membership amongst people who are living, working in the communities that we most need to be fighting with. I think a lot of it has to do with, for example, I think one thing that we've really done that's been really great is run candidates for office who are from neighborhoods that they end up representing. I think Ferris Front Forest is a really, really good example of this. And I think that one thing that we can do now is, now that she is going to be our representative, we can continue to build in that neighborhood. So it's not just like we went in there, we tried to get people's votes, and like now we're leaving and they'll never hear from us again. We can like use her candidacy, her office as a base to continue to organize in that neighborhood. And we'll need to be like realistic about like, what can DSA do and what can DSA be supporting other organizations to do. So like an important formation that like Farah was really active in is the Crown Heights Tenants Union. I think we need to be seeking out and helping support other organizations that are like on the ground, being like representative, organizing their communities to grow the movement. Like we don't have to be like, DSA doesn't have to be, in my opinion, like identical with the movement. DSA isn't the thing that everything has to be subsumed into. DSA should recognize their role as like one among many like players and actors who are fighting for common goals. But it's a tough question for sure.
So the next person on stack is actually myself. And the question I have is actually similar to what Ashley asked, but it's in a different kind of question, which is similar to what Obi asked, which is, the movements that happened this summer with like Black Lives Matter and in the fallout of George Floyd, in my opinion, and I think other people have also made this observation, that there seems to have kind of been like, there's these two kind of Black Lives Matter. There's Black Lives Matter and there's Black Lives Matter, in a sense that there's like the initial kind of original demand, which were radical, which were, importantly in terms of overcoming the exploitation of Black people in this country and of all exploited people in this country, but specifically through the lens of the way Black people have been treated in this country. And then there's the corporatized neoliberal version, which is about, well, we need more representation. We need to be better and kind of do slight changes in terms of the system. And the reason why I mention that is why is it that you think it was so easily co-opted? Not in the community. There's like an agreement or discussion about how much it was co-opted, but point is like, why is it that that occurred, and why is it that say like obviously the movement that happened in December wasn't spontaneous eruption of like people wanting to. It kind of just ended up being a lot of people going out. Of course, people who organized it, of course, but millions of people with nothing to kind of like. It's difficult to kind of say all of that was just organized. So I guess why is it just lack of organization? Is there no like coherent structure? Like because Black Lives Matter is like just the fundamental structure of BLM that was, because it was decentralized, led it so easily to be co-opted. Why is it that you think that it was this vagueness of the movement itself that allowed that to happen?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I don't think Black Lives Matter was like entirely co-opted so much that it kind of like, it naturally sort of came to a conclusion because the level of protests that were going was just like not sustainable. Like it couldn't go on forever. And I think, one of the reasons that it couldn't go on forever is because, is what you said, there wasn't like there weren't like layers of organizers who were like continuing to think strategically about, continue to call like targeted actions to extract concessions. I think that definitely has to do with it. I don't think Black Lives Matter was like completely co-opted. And I think like if we think of this as like very like long-term and durational, we're still in the Black Lives Matter movement, and its demands now are not co-optable. Like if there is like an amazing, I think, degree of consensus around like a pretty radical demand, which is defunding the police. And that is a demand that it's going to be really hard to co-opt, because it's just like antithetical to what like the police, the PBA, the state want to do. I think that, if we would think of the first Black Lives Matter iteration as having been co-opted, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that there wasn't really coherent demand. And so like Obama and other like government officials could sort of pass off reform, like body cameras and like community police training as responses to the protests. And there was like no one to really say firmly, like, that's not what we want. Like, that is not what the protests were about. But like, my hope is that this time around, like the defund demand is gonna really stick and it can't be co-opted. And so we'll continue to see like local level organizing in response to it.
Thank you. Next on stock is Paul Horowitz.
Second, everybody, a great presentation. Really, really, thank you so much. I want to go back to your example, the example of the civil rights campaign in Albany, because I think it is Albany, Georgia, because I think it is really instructive. And there have been much discussion about why it was not as successful as the campaign in Birmingham. And the question is, in terms of bringing it to contemporary stuff, like even the Black Lives Matter protests, which brought so many people out to the street, maybe the biggest mass protest in US history. Another example, May 68, you had 40 million French workers on strike. And then 6 weeks later, when, the Gaullists actually won the election, when the Gaulle government resigned and whatever. So the question is, like, on the one hand, there's this challenge about mobilizing and the organizational forms of the mobilization and the tactics and all of that. But there's also the question about how people who are not in the streets and not on strike are responding to those, to the activists who are, right? Not some of the people who aren't are racist or fascist or owners or capitalists or whatever, and you wouldn't expect them. But a lot of people, even with the numbers we saw over the months after George Floyd was murdered, there's a mass of people who are on the sidelines, right? And I think we do need to think through about them and how Trump was able to appeal to them, or how they wind up either staying on the sidelines or actually supporting, you know, the reaction, the Blue Lives Matter, or the you know, keep police funding, or whatever, that whole discourse, right? And then in terms of the dynamic, the relationship between social movements and, let's say, electoral stuff or other ways that politics gets expressed in the workplace, you know, strikes and whatever, this question about how the majority, the mass of people who are not yet mobilized can be won over to our side, you know, and how that informs your thinking about social movements.
Yeah, I mean, you've laid out a lot of sort of important history here for us, and I don't really know if I have like a way to answer this question. I mean, looking historically, like it seems really clear that like even though everyone wasn't out on the streets at protests during the civil rights movement, Northern sentiment was like overwhelmingly in support of civil rights, of desegregation, of like ensuring the franchise to Black voters. It was popular in the North. And, you know, it's been argued that like to some extent that is in part because like the Northerners didn't have there was no threat to them from that happening. Whereas like in the South still there was at least some extent perception of the fact that, you know, equal rights for Black people was some kind of like either maybe in some ways material, but like also like social conceptual like threat. So I think that like, you know, people have an investment in like their interests. So they're like looking even further into the past for like a historical example. We could think of like abolition. Abolition sometimes gets framed as a demand that was like only only like a very limited number of white radicals were making, but that actually isn't true. Abolition was to some extent a like mass movement in the North and specifically in the West, because white people were recognizing that it was in their interest to prevent the expansion of slavery into the new territories that were opening up for settlement and agriculture, because slavery in those territories would devalue white labor. So like lots of white people realized that they also had a material interest in curtailing the expansion of slavery. So abolition to some extent became like a mass movement. So in part, it is, I think, a question of like getting people to recognize their material interest in a movement. And like, I think with defund, like it's pretty clear that like in places like New York, where billions of dollars are being spent on policing that could be spent elsewhere, it is in the material interest of a large number of people to defund the police. But in other ways, like Black Lives Matter is interesting because I think in some ways it's harder. It can be harder to like make the argument to people that they have like a material interest in ending police violence, not because they don't, because that's just not how people think of it. People don't recognize or realize the extent to which like white people are also murdered by the police. It's just like not part of the narrative at all, which is, you know, that's how it is. And so I think that like there are ways in which while we want to like obviously and clearly recognize like the particular and singular injustice of the disproportionate killings of Black people at the hands of the police, like there are other ways in which everyone should recognize that the police are like a leech on society. They're violent, they're oppressive to everybody. So I think that's how I would like approach that question, but also like I want to be cognizant that like that's not the way that most people are thinking about organizing along this issue, and it's not even the way a lot of white people are thinking about organizing on this issue. So I don't know exactly what those histories that you brought up, Paul, and like the ones I mentioned, what advice they actually give us. But those are, I guess, just some thoughts.
Next person on stack is Lee.
Yeah, hi. That was a great presentation. I really appreciate it. I just wanted to point, I think people have been talking about organization, and I think there's different kinds of organization. You know, when we talk about the Southern Christian Leadership Conference or the Communist Party, you know, these organizations existed in the presence of massive people's organizations. They had a massive renters, tenants associations, you know, and in the South, they had massive organizations. The SCLC, all of the Black colleges in the South had giant student organizations. And in the civil rights movement, it was largely churches, but these were mass organizations. And I think we have to distinguish between organizations like DSA and mass organizations. And I think you have to build mass organizations to really build, you know, conscious political organizations. You know, I mean, I'm not, you know, I'm for DSA growing, that's great. But if it grows and those members are not associated with their neighborhoods and their workplaces and their associations in a progressive and conscious way, doesn't really mean that much. I mean, having, you know, 85,000 people or 100,000 people in a 300 million person country doesn't mean much if those people aren't part of mass organizations, aren't consciously out there amongst the people they live in, helping to lead those people around their, you know, needs, which are different for different people. So when we're talking about mutual aid organization, you know, I think mutual aid organizations are great and in this period, but I think it's important not just to do the mutual aid, but to try to organize the mutual aid organization as a conscious political organization that's speaking to the needs of the people they're helping in a progressive way. And, you know, even here in, you know, with the election work that we're doing, you know, it's good to pick out some neighborhoods and try and make progress in those. But at the same time, I think we have, you know, thousands of people in North Brooklyn alone who are members. And if we're just disembodied people going somewhere else to do political work, you know, it's a different kind of progress. We need to be, you know, like fish in the sea. We each need to be organizing in our neighborhoods, on our blocks, amongst the people we know, amongst the people we've done political work with, and then building the political organizations, you know, becomes, you know, much more effective and becomes more related to the movement. So when we're talking about organization and movement, I think those intermediate organizations and being consciously present in them is the key. I just wonder if you would comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think that, you know, an issue we face is that like most people do not see a reason for them to join DSA in the same way, because it's like so big and focuses on like citywide projects. They don't see the same kind of reason to join DSA as they might to see joining their like local tenants association. Like that has a much clearer impact on like their day-to-day life in the place that they live. I think even the civil rights movement, there were like different scales of organizations, though. Like SCLC is really big, but both SNCC and CORE were quite small. I don't know that either of them had more than like, I mean, they must have had like around 5,000, 7,000 members. And so they were kind of like these like cadre groups that did these like very heroic feats of organizing. And a lot of them were students. A lot of them were in fact white. It was like a very these very multiracial organizations. So I think that like, I'm not saying that DSA should like be like CORE or SNCC, like that's not the kind of thing that I feel like we really are able to do. But I think that like there is, as you're saying, there's room for different scales of organizations. I mean, I think one of the things that makes me think the most sad is just like the total decay of organizational life in America. Like, you know, 50s, even as recently as like 50, 60, 70 years ago, like people were part of organizations. That was just like a part of what they did, who they were, how they socialized. Whole families were involved, and that's just like it's just not a thing anymore. People aren't like that, and we see like vestiges of that hanging on in unions. Hopefully that can be revived again. We see like vestiges of hanging that on in like, you know, like in smaller cities like Shriners and things like that, but like we don't have organizations in the way we used to, and I just like that's a problem that I really don't know how to fix. I mean, in terms of political organizations, like the more that political organizations like DSA and like 10 unions can win, the more people will join them. But I don't really have an answer for like the macro problem of how people don't know how to and don't know that they should be in organizations.
Jeremy?
Oh, wow. I'm trying to remember what was on my mind. This is a lot of great stuff. I think I had two brief things. One was just to Laura. I think it was Laura's question earlier about kind of like the long term. And I mean, I definitely also felt one thing that was sort of like trippy in a way for me was that like, you know, we had sort of come off the Bernie moment where there was this like kind of huge imagination of what society could be. And then the protests broke out, and for all their radicalism sort of on the streets, the demand, defund in many ways, I think you're right, Rachel, is like a less co-optable demand than the previous period, but it still is like a relatively kind of police-specific demand. Like it still is like, you know, I mean, as you pointed out, the background conditions were COVID breaking out, but it wasn't like the masses that moved down the streets were like, you know, demanding Bernie's program. And what I thought, you know, part of what I guess my thought about that is just that that's part of the work of DSA is exactly to like help that program just like deepen and broaden so that when mass movements come, it's like more people think they can get like the whole thing. Like they think they can get less cops breathing down their neck and killing them, but also that they can get healthcare when they go out in the streets and demand it. So that was one thought, that part of the role of being in a group like DSA and the work we have to do is to deepen the roots of that imagination of what a different society could be, make wins that make people think it's possible. The other question, briefly, I just had is like, you know, I wonder, I don't know, this is maybe a weird question, but I'm just, you know, one of the things I think is so valuable that you were doing in this session is talking about sort of the legacy of the civil rights movement. And I think, you know, there's this ironic way in which one of the legacies of the civil rights movement is to some degree like the layer of African-American establishment politicians like the Congressional Black Caucus that is one of the foremost obstacles to left-wing politics in the country right now. On the other hand, there's a way in which like left-wingers can sometimes be sort of dismissive of the civil rights movement. They're like, yeah, like boring, Martin Luther King, like, you know, he had a dream, I get it, like we're more radical than that. rather than sort of saying, hey, like our politics went mainstream, kind of the civil rights movement actually had this radicalism. So I guess just in the vague sense, like, what do you think, like, is the legacy of the civil rights movement for today's left, and how do we kind of restore the memory of like the civil rights movement in its depth?
Yeah, it's a big question. You're so right that like one of the outcomes of the civil rights movement is like, you know, once like integration is achieved, once like the demands that were so radical become kind of like, you know, normalized, that like, you know, two things happen to the movement. Like one, like you said, a lot of its leaders get positions in government, or if not in government, in like large nonprofit organizations, and that like saps the movement of leaders, because now to those people it seems like the place to be really continuing to fight for change is from office, from appointed positions in administrations. And then the other offshoot that we see is like Black radicalism, which is like very insular, and really like in many ways very community oriented. I mean, we can see like mutual aid work as a real descendant of the legacy of Black radicalism, like highly community focused, like no longer really interested in making the kind of like class-wide demands that someone like A. Philip Randolph was making. And so like, I think, you know, it's interesting, a lot of people look at that period and like think that like Black radicalism, Black nationalism, like is like the truly radical content, like that supplanted like sort of a milquetoast, like, you know, conciliatory civil rights movement. But I just don't think that that is like true. The content of the civil rights movement was like deeply, deeply radical. And their tactics were too, I would say. I mean, I think it's always kind of weird when the, like people, not weird, but like, you know, people say that like the non-violence, like the tactic of non-violence, is maybe played out or something like that. But like the term, even the term nonviolence applied to the organizing that they were doing, I feel like can be kind of misleading or obfuscating, because they were enduring like intense violence at the hands of the police, and at the hands of white Southerners who were shooting Black activists, like lynching them, police who were like breaking people's ribs, and fracturing their legs with like water cannons. Nonviolence like was a strategy that worked because it was in the face of an intense violence, and that's a juxtaposition it drew upon. And it's like so brave and so radical for those activists to do that. I mean, I think that like, and this is something that the readings for this week brought up, is like, I think that the economic aspect of the civil rights movement's demands have to be like continually reiterated for people to understand the radical content of the movement. Something like, you know, A. Philip Randolph's freedom budget, which is like, well, it's not socialism per se, but it is like, it's like closer to it than any like massive political programs since then. But by that sort of time in his life, towards the end of his life, A. Philip Randolph was kind of like a social democrat, I guess, but still pretty radical in terms of his economic program. I think like it's important to remember, like, even the contents of like desegregation had important sort of like radical material context. Like it wasn't and like a conceptual or moral demand. So I think that like when we remember the civil rights movement, remember its legacy, we want to be remembering that radical content, and also remembering that the civil rights movement was a movement about interracial solidarity. It was not just Black people in the civil rights movement. Like it was Black leaders for sure. But the civil rights movement would not have been possible without like the massive multiracial coalition that was formed between white Northerners, Black Southerners, and a lot of militant militant activists, Black and white activists, in organizations like SNCC and CORE. So I think we also like can't leave behind the fact that like solidarity is deeply important across racial lines. And then I guess the final point is like to never be forgetting like the role of like the unions and labor in the civil rights movement either. So I think those are just some things that we have to be drawing from the civil rights movement. Definitely at a certain point in my political life, like when I was like younger, I was like, oh, civil rights movement, like that's played out, like that's done. But it's like so not at all. There's lots of lessons to be learned.
Okay, and I think last on stack is Holly.
Yes. Thank you so much, Rachel. This has been a great, I feel like this conversation has been something I've been waiting for to happen in DSA since I've sort of started getting into it at the beginning of the summer. I know a lot of people have been in it since before this movement this year, but I'm pretty new to democratic socialism in general and sort of trying to wrap together everything everybody has said. I think one of the biggest questions, and what Laura brought up earlier and what Ashley was saying, is how to sort of reckon with where our time and energy is going into when there are so many grassroots Black Lives Matter mutual aid programs out there still going, still protesting, still doing things right now, and how sometimes coming into this dynamic, I know that we all are here with that and wanting that, but how to actually connect, like, oh, DSA has planned an action for a Saturday, but like, you know, Abolition Park or Warriors in the Guardian or Astoria Mutual Aid also has the same action that same time of that day, and how to sort of connect everything together more so it doesn't feel like we have a million different organizations that, you know, Abolition and Socialism, it from where I've been learning this summer from all of the leaders, especially in the BIPOC community, there's so much that comes together in it, but I feel like there is sort of this, a little bit of a, when I'm going to sort of my more Black Lives Matter, Abolition Park organized events, they feel like there's people have stopped caring about them and stopped helping them. And then I come in here and I know we're trying to recruit people too, and there's so much of like, oh, if I could just, there was a way to make everybody believe that we're in it together, and there are so many Black leaders who are incredible out there in New York City on the streets doing this right now, and how to make them believe that we're gonna show up for their things as well, so they can come into these conversations and we can all start learning together, I guess, you know. And like Laura said, sort of choose, I don't want to have to choose between where I'm putting my energy, and if it's appropriate to sort of bring it into DSA and say, oh, well, you know, this thing is already happening, it's along the same lines and with the same intention of these other things DSA is trying to organize, like, is it appropriate, I guess, to sort of, it's not sell it is a bad word, but bring it in and educate within here about the things already happening, and then we sort of join into those things to show its solidarity with the actual people doing the organizing on the streets, opposed to sort of this overhanging umbrella organization, if that makes sense.
Yeah, this is a good sort of like logistical question, thinking about like the organizing landscape in New York. One thing that I find really, you know, frustrating, that I don't have a lot of patience for, is when like one group or mostly one group like tries to sort of claim like ownership over any kind of like movement or like demand. And I think it's something that's really important that like DSA be careful like not to do. Like, you know, DSA didn't invent demand to defund the police, but also I think it's something that like people like fall prey to more often than I want them to. It's like no one needs to own the movement. And so I think like it's important to have people doing what it sounds like you're doing, who are like, you know, maybe positioned in more than one group, and can be like forging connections between them. DSA does really need to be in relationships. sorry, I don't know if you can, my partner is phone banking in the other room. I don't know if you can hear her. DSA does really need to be in relationships with other organizations in the city, but like other organizations also need to be in relationship with DSA. Like, I'll just say it, like DSA is a really, is like really, really working hard and like, to build power for like the working class in this city. And so I think we really have to be working together, and that'll happen a lot through sort of organic but also intentional relationship building across different spaces. In terms of like where we organize and like where we spend time, I think that like wherever we do that, it's important to like think through some of the like movement strategic things that that we were like talking about today. Like, are we organizing in a way that is going to like put disruptive pressure on a on someone who has the power to grant our demands? And I'm not saying like that's what we have to be doing like all the time, but like making sure that our organizing like, you know, involves like strategic components of that nature is important to try to win a demand like defunding the police. And it's like obviously not the only thing we're going to be doing. Like mutual aid exists along a different kind of pattern and has a different kind of end. But like I think that like in terms of thinking about like where we want to expend our efforts to avoid burning out, we want to like be inserting ourselves into campaigns inside and outside of DSA that have like goals that are winnable, that have like strategies to reach those goals. Otherwise, we're just gonna like spin our wheels and get exhausted. And like, if that isn't present in a space where we're organizing, like, you know, work with people to build that, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I'm hopeful that the next year or so we'll see closer connections developing between DSA and other organizations and groups in this city.
Rachel, thank you so much for just such a rich evening of discussion and bringing up so many good points and everybody's contributions. We had a really good retention rate of students tonight. It was a really engaging evening. But I think we're going to wrap it up, and Jeremy is going to sign us off with announcements.
Just a few brief announcements. Yeah, again, thank you so much, Rachel. Really, really appreciate it. And really appreciate everyone with questions, all the comrades. Thank you so much. A few brief announcements. First of all, we always try to do some action follow-ups from this session. So please join DSA if you're not a member. And if you are a member, please contribute chapter dues to our organization. One of the things, you know, DSA is a mass membership organization. We're a democratic organization. We do not, as Kianga Yamada-Taylor talks about, we don't go to nonprofits for our funding, which allows us to be radical and true to our values. But that means we need members to contribute. So please sign up for New York City dues. We're doing a New York City dues drive right now. We're going to post the link in the chat. Please, please, please do that. I give $15 a month to the chapter because I want us to grow and accomplish our aims. And whatever you can do would massively increase our capacity to do ambitious things in the future. Get involved with the Racial Justice Working Group and our Defund NYPD work. Again, Carrington is kindly putting the links in the chat. And finally, we have a Tax the Rich campaign, which is in the midst of a week of action. I'm field leading a door hanging shift, one of those things. Fanon obviously is making calls in the other room, organizing our neighbors to tax the rich so that we can build a society in New York State that is decent, that is fair, that is racially and economically just. And there's the money to do it. We just need the political will and the organizing. So those are all action asks. Now for political education stuff, night school is going on winter break, but we will be back. January 11th is the first one, I believe, with Thomas Frank, who people might know, really, I think one of our great political essayists alive, and has been writing amazing, hard-hitting stuff from his book, What's the Matter with Kansas, to Listen Liberal. And he has a new book out on populism, The People Know. Actually, it's sort of on anti-populism and why elites hate populism. So that is going to be a great session. He'll talk about his new book, and that's going to be the kickoff for night school in the winter. Tell your friends and come to our next semester, which is a little more focused. This semester is focused kind of on like big ideas of the left. The next semester is a little more programmatically focused on, we're going to start in populism, but we'll go through a lot of our campaigns, talk more in depth about strategic questions raised by the things we want to achieve in this society: healthcare, housing, taxing the rich, eco-socialism, ending mass incarceration, all the rest. We're going to have a holiday movie as the North Brooklyn branch. We're watching Pride, link TBA, December 18th, though, Friday night. Bring popcorn and your friends. Again, a cool way for maybe non-members also to plug in. It's a wonderful, heartbreaking kind of a movie. I always tear up at the end. And it's actually a happy movie about politics, which we need some more of. I think that is it. Do I have anything else? We're polyed, get involved. Email us if you want to get involved. And yeah, I think that's everything. Tax the rich. And thank you so much again to Rachel. Thanks to everybody here. Have a good night.
Hi, everyone. It was nice to join.
Thanks, Rachel.
Best branch, right?
Second best branch.